Here, we drive through the small town of Port Jervis, just 90 minutes outside of New York City. The town has many historic buildings. This is Main Street. That is the Methodist Church. It would not be clear to any passerby that on June 2, 1893, these streets were full of 2,000 rioters, hell-bent on finding and murdering Bob Lewis. Bob Lewis lost his life that day, and his death is a testament to the racism that rumbled in the back of all American society, not just the South. In the late 19th century, Port Jervis was incredibly segregated. The Black community, who all lived on the same street, accounted for less than 5% of the town's population, or about 200 people. Born and raised in Port Jervis, Lewis was the stepson of Happy Hank Jackson, a well-loved Port Jervis resident. In the years prior to his murder, Lewis spent his time between Port Jervis and Paterson, New Jersey, where his mother lived. Bob Lewis was single, which was not uncommon for a man of his age or stature, but many of the Black residents in Port Jervis lived in nuclear families that were easily digestible for the overwhelming white majority. As a station on the Erie Railroad to New York City, Port Jervis began as a quick stop for lonely railroad workers. In the 1880s, Port Jervis housed 80 saloons in their town of only 10,000 residents. For the next decade, the white Protestant locals worked hard to eradicate such a ghastly reputation. On Thursday, June 2, 1893, workers tired for the late spring day at the stove-making and glass-blowing factories. This season, Bob Lewis was working as a hotel clerk at the Delaware House. It was at this job some months earlier that he had met Peter Foley, a resident of the hotel. Peter Foley worked as an insurance agent. He was white and in a relationship with a girl 11 years younger than him, one Lena McMahon. Foley had faced jail time the year before for evading a bill from the very hotel Lewis worked at. Because of his criminal record, McMahon's parents had forbidden her from seeing Foley anymore. However, they continued their relationship in secret. That morning, McMahon had been in an argument with her mother that ended with her running away from home and to the Delaware House to see Foley. To console her, Peter Foley decided to take Lena McMahon on a walk along the Delaware River. The story that Foley and the evening newspapers reported is that on this walk, Foley left McMahon to get lunch for the two of them. Soon after, Bob Lewis attacked McMahon. Lewis then fled Port Jervis. McMahon was attended to by several community members, including Solomon Carley, who was particularly aggravated by the assault. Despite her injuries, McMahon was reported to have walked away from the crime scene with apparent ease. While she was being treated, Lena gave a description of her attacker that, to the crowd, aligned with Bob Lewis. It is essential to establish doubt in this story early. When asked if she knew Bob Lewis, McMahon said she had never seen him before. However, Bob Lewis had served as a messenger for McMahon and Foley many times when he was on shift at the Delaware House. McMahon's story also changed many times in the days following her attack. At first, she said Foley had left her at the riverbank because she was, quote, waiting for a train to Boston. But this makes no sense because the train station was about 2 miles down the bank from where the attack was reported. By whatever standards, the crowd had decided that Bob Lewis was Lena's assailant, even though it is unclear how he matched her description. Solomon Carley led a group of men in the direction that they believed Lewis had gone. They spotted him on a boat along the canal, and they stood on the shore and asked Lewis for assistance, calling him along the water. When Lewis's boat docked on the waterfront, the men seized him, reportedly jeering, "Well, Bob, guess we'll have to take you with us." The men rowed back into Port Jervis with Lewis. There was already a crowd of white folks gathering in the town square. On this ride back, Lewis told the men what happened from his perspective. Lewis claimed that he was fishing on the river when Foley approached him and said that there was a nice woman just down the river and he, quote, didn't care what happened to her. Essentially, from Lewis's account, Foley pimped McMahon to Lewis, and Lewis acted how he was set up to act. When considering the context of Foley and McMahon's relationship, this story seems plausible. If Foley wanted to prove himself to McMahon's family, what better way than to save her from being assaulted by a black man? When the carriage arrived in town, only 8 police officers had responded to the order to escort Lewis to the county jail. These measly officers were no match for the crowd of now 2,000 rioters. The crowd quickly and efficiently overwhelmed them and took Lewis, placing a rope around his neck and dragging him to the nearest tree. The first attempt to lynch Lewis was stopped by the town president, who asked the crowd to let justice take its course against this man. Yet, the crowd continued to beat and stab Lewis until the president's words were moot. The mob moved to the Methodist Church on Main Street and tried, for a second time, to hang Lewis. This time, a prominent lawyer ran to the front of the crowd and claimed that he would defend Lewis in court. He even persuaded a doctor to attend to Lewis's wounds while they waited for a trial. But the mob was hell-bent and incorrigible. For a final time, Lewis was lifted off the ground, and this time he died. His body hung in the tree for an hour as heavy rain washed his blood-soaked clothes. For months after, people would hack away at pieces of the tree, wanting a keepsake from the event. The black residents of Port Jervis, the men, women, and children that Lewis had known all of his life, compiled enough funds between themselves to buy Lewis a grave and give him a proper burial. At the service, white residents overwhelmed the mourning black community. They cut off pieces of Lewis's clothing and locks of his hair. A brief and perfunctory trial was held in the following week. Dozens of witnesses were called to the stand, but no one was ever convicted, even though the men who lynched Bob Lewis could be called off by name. John Kinsella, D.C. McCobbs, John Egan, John Henley, Patrick Collier, Lewis Avery, James Curry, Lorenzo Woods, and a man named Fitzgibbons. The vitriol and hatred of Port Jervis was not made in one day. It was simmering, looking for an excuse, and Bob Lewis gave them an excuse. Each year in early June, the Port Jervis newspaper runs an article about the lynching, often calling it Port Jervis's darkest day. Even though I was able to account for almost every event from the day that Lewis was lynched, what I could find about his life and family was sparse. Perhaps this is because Lewis's life was taken before he was able to have a family for himself. Or perhaps Port Jervis was so caught up in the violence its residents perpetrated that they did not consider the resident that they lost. Bob Lewis was a community member, a son who visited his mother in New Jersey many times a year. He was a worker and beloved, and he was murdered at the hands of persons unknown.